Did you know that the average person in the United States moves 11.7 times in their lifetime? Or that 1 in 5 Americans says they feel lonely or socially isolated? We live in a world of incredible connection, a global village linked by fiber optics and satellites. Yet we feel disconnected. We have more friends on social media than we could ever meet, but we might not know our next door neighbor's name. It feels like something is missing. Maybe we forgot something important along the way. Maybe in our rush for progress, for individualism, for efficiency, we left behind some basic truths about how to live together. It's easy to dismiss the Middle Ages as a dark, brutal time. And in many ways it was. Life was hard, disease was rampant. But people were bound together in ways we can barely imagine. Their survival depended on it. They knew things about community that we have forgotten. These aren't secrets or hacks. They are just simple, powerful ideas forged in a time when your neighbor wasn't just someone who lived next to you. Your neighbor was your safety net, your support system, your world. What if the key to our modern loneliness lies buried in the so-called dark ages? What if they knew how to belong? Number 16, what if our calendars weren't about work? Think about your calendar. It is a grid of obligations. It is dominated by the work week, Monday to Friday. Even our holidays are scheduled for convenience, like the floating President's Day. The rhythm of our lives is the rhythm of a machine. It is linear, predictable, and productive. This was not the case in the Middle Ages. Their calendar was a circle, not a line. It was a story told over and over again each year. And it was not about work, it was about God, nature, and community. The main organizing principle was the liturgical year. It started with Advent, moved through Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, and so on. These were not just dates on a calendar, they were seasons with their own moods, their own foods, their own rituals. Lent was a time of fasting and quiet reflection. Easter was a time of feasting and celebration. The historian Eamon Duffy, in his book The Stripping of the Altars, shows how deeply this religious calendar shaped everyday life in pre-Reformation England. People didn't just go to church on Sunday. The church's rhythm was their rhythm. It told them when to plant, and when to harvest, when to marry, and when to mourn. But it wasn't all solemn. The medieval calendar was packed with holidays, or, more accurately, holy days. Some estimates suggest that in parts of Europe, people had up to a third of the year off from regular labor for feast days and festivals. Think about that. Over 100 days a year, these weren't just days off, they were mandatory community events. The feast day of a town's patron saint would involve a parade, a public mass, and then a massive celebration. There would be games, drinking, and dancing. The Feast of Fools, held around New Year's, was a day when social hierarchies were turned upside down. A junior cleric might be elected, bishop for a day, and mock the real bishop. It was a pressure valve, a way for the community to laugh at itself and its leaders. These events broke the monotony of hard labor. They reinforced social bonds. You celebrated with the same people you worked with, argued with, and depended on. Our modern world has tried to replace this. We have commercialized holidays. Christmas is about buying gifts. Easter is about chocolate. We have national holidays, which are often just an excuse for a long weekend and a mattress sale. These events don't bring us together in the same way. We celebrate with our immediate family, or we use the time to run errands. The shared, public, and often rowdy joy of the medieval holy day is gone. We have traded a sacred, cyclical calendar for a secular, productive one. We gained efficiency, but we may have lost a fundamental source of collective joy and meaning. We have so much data about medieval life, from tax records to church documents, but how did it actually feel to live by a liturgical calendar instead of a work calendar? Did the constant festivals truly relieve the pressure of a hard life, or were they just a fleeting distraction from endless toil? What was the real emotional texture of a world where time was a recurring story, not a race to the finish line? And if we could somehow bring back a calendar based on shared celebration instead of individual productivity, would it even work in our fragmented society? Number 15, what if justice was a local show? When you have a dispute with someone today, what do? You might send a formal email. You might hire a lawyer. The conflict becomes abstract, handled by professionals in sterile courtrooms far away. Justice is a system, not a relationship. It is impersonal and remote. In the Middle Ages, justice was intensely local and personal. For the vast majority of people who were peasants living on a manor, justice was dispensed in the manorial court. This court wasn't in a grand building in a distant city. It was often held in the Lord's Hall, or even outdoors, under a prominent tree. The Lord or his steward would preside, but the jury was made up of other villagers. So your neighbors, the people who saw you every day. Imagine being accused of letting your pigs wander into your neighbor's garden. You wouldn't be served with a lawsuit. You would be brought before the court, and your neighbor would state his case. Then you would state yours. And the jury, men who knew you both, who knew the layout of the village, who probably knew the specific pigs in question, would decide the outcome. The records of these courts, like those from the Manor of Wakefield in England, are fascinating. They are filled with the tiny dramas of everyday life, fines for brewing bad ale, disputes over plowing boundaries, accusations of gossip. The punishments were also local and visible. A small fine, usually paid in goods like grain or ale, was common. But for social transgressions, the punishments were designed for public shame. The stocks were a classic example. A person would be locked in the middle of the village square for everyone to see and mock. The scold's bridle was a metal cage fitted over the head of a woman accused of nagging or gossip, designed to prevent her from speaking. These punishments seem barbaric to us, and they were, but they served a specific purpose. They were a form of communication. They told the entire community, this behavior is not acceptable here. Justice wasn't just about punishing an individual, it was about reinforcing the shared values of the group. This system had huge problems. It was biased. The Lord had all the real power. It could be used to settle personal scores. There was little concept of objective evidence. But it had one thing our system lacks: immediacy. The consequences of your actions were felt directly within the community. Your reputation was your most valuable asset, and a judgment against you in the manorial court could ruin it. People had to face each other. They had to find a way to resolve their conflicts and continue living side by side. Our system allows us to use lawyers and courts to avoid ever having to look our opponent in the eye again. Here we get a resolution, but the community itself is not healed. Historians can read the court rolls and see what people were punished for, but can we ever truly understand the role of shame in a small, closed community? Was public shaming an effective deterrent that maintained social order, or did it just create deep, lasting resentments that festered for generations? How often was the justice of the manorial court just the bullying of the weak by the powerful? And is there a way to bring back the idea of local, restorative justice without also bringing back its cruelty and bias? Number 14, what if your work was your identity? What do you do for a living? For us, it's a job. It's a role we perform to earn money. Like, we might change careers multiple times. Like, our work is a part of our life, but it doesn't always define our entire identity. We separate our work self from our home self. Like in the medieval town, your work was everything. It was your name, your social circle, your safety net, and your source of pride. This was the world of the guilds. A guild was an association of all the artisans or merchants in a particular craft. There was a guild for weavers, a guild for blacksmiths, a guild for bakers, a guild for masons. If you wanted to practice a trade in a town, you had to belong to the guild. The guilds controlled everything. They set the prices for goods. They set the standards for quality. A loaf of bread had to be a certain weight. A piece of cloth had to have a certain thread count. This wasn't just about economics. It was about civic pride. The reputation of the town's weavers reflected on the entire town. The guild would inspect workshops to ensure no one was cutting corners. As the historian Stephen A. Epstein notes in his work on medieval guilds, they were a mix of trade union, cartel, and social club. To become a master craftsman, you followed a strict path. You started as an apprentice, usually as a young boy. You lived in your master's house, and he was responsible for your training, your food, your lodging, and your moral upbringing. After years of apprenticeship, you became a journeyman, traveling and working for different masters. To finally become a master yourself, you had to produce a masterpiece, a piece of work that demonstrated your skill to the other masters of the guild. And only then could you open your own shop. This system created deep bonds. The members of the guild were like a family. They celebrated religious festivals together. They marched together in civic parades, each guild with its own banner and uniform. They took care of each other. If a guild member fell sick, the guild would support his family. If he died, the guild would pay for his funeral and provide for his widow and orphans. The guild was a complete social welfare system long before governments took on that role. Your identity was inseparable from your craft. You weren't John, who happens to be a baker. You were John the Baker. It was so fundamental that it became your last name. Smith, Cooper, Fletcher, Wright, these are the ghosts of the guild system. We have lost this connection. Work is often alienating. We work for large, faceless corporations. We rarely see the finished product of our labor. We feel little connection to our colleagues outside of work tasks. The pride of the masterpiece, the security of the guild, the identity of the craftsman, these have been replaced by the flexibility of the gig economy and the anonymity of the global supply chain. The guilds sound protective and supportive, but how much did they stifle innovation by controlling methods and prices? Were they truly meritocratic, or did they become exclusive clubs where only the sons and relatives of existing masters could get ahead? We see the rules and the structure, but what did it feel like to be a journeyman who was repeatedly denied master status for political reasons? And could the principles of the guild equality, control, mutual support, and shared identity ever be applied to modern forms of work without becoming a restrictive monopoly? Number 13, what if you couldn't leave? We see mobility as a fundamental right. We can move to a new city for a job, a new state for a better climate, a new country for a new life. Our identity is portable. We can reinvent ourselves. This freedom is central to our modern idea of self. For the majority of people in the Middle Ages, this was unthinkable. If you were a serf, you were legally tied to the land. You could not leave the manor without the Lord's permission. You were, in a very real sense, part of the property. The Domesday Book of 1086, a massive survey of England commissioned by William the Conqueror, wasn't just counting land and livestock. It was counting the people who were bound to that land. They were a resource like a forest or a river. This lack of mobility created a community of incredible density and depth. You lived in the same village your parents lived in, and your grandparents before them. You knew everyone. You knew their family histories, their scandals, their triumphs. The web of relationships was impossibly thick. Your life was interwoven with the lives of a few hundred other people in a way we can't comprehend. This was a society of intimates, as some historians call it. This had profound consequences. On the one hand, it created a powerful sense of belonging and security. You always had a place. You were never a stranger. In times of trouble, the community was your only safety net. If your barn burned down, your neighbors would help you rebuild it, because they knew they might need your help next year. This is the concept of mutual aid, born of necessity. There was no insurance company. There was no government program. There was only your neighbor. On the other hand, it could be suffocating. There were no secrets. Your business was everyone's business. Grudges could last for generations. The community's pressure to conform was immense. If you were different, if you didn't fit in, life could be miserable. There was no escape. You couldn't just pack up and move to a place where nobody knew you. The same faces, the same feuds, the same expectations, day in and day out for your entire life. The Black Death in the mid-14th century dramatically changed this. The plague wiped out a huge portion of the population, perhaps as much as half of Europe. Suddenly, labor was scarce. Lords needed workers. For the first time, peasants had leverage. Many broke their bonds and moved to find better wages and more freedom. This was the beginning of the end for serfdom. It was a crack in the foundation of the old, static world. We are the inheritors of that newfound mobility. We have the freedom to leave, but in doing so, we may have forgotten how to stay. We can study manorial records and see how many people were tied to the land, but can we ever grasp the psychological impact of knowing you would likely die within a few miles of where you were born? Was that sense of permanence a source of profound comfort or unbearable claustrophobia? How did communities handle deep, multi-generational conflicts when no one could ever leave? And what is the true cost of our modern hypermobility? The constant severing and reforming of social ties. It's number 12. What if God lived next door? For most of us today, religion is a private matter. We might go to a church, a mosque, or a synagogue, or we might not. It is a choice. It is one part of our life, separate from our work, our politics, our social life. In the Middle Ages, the parish was not just a church, it was the fundamental unit of community. The entire social, spiritual, and even administrative life of a village revolved around the parish church. It was the only stone building in a village of wood. and thatch huts. It was the largest indoor space. It was the center of everything. The church building itself was a community hub. The nave was used for markets, for legal proceedings, and for village meetings. It was a place of sanctuary and a storehouse in times of trouble. The church bells marked the hours of the day, calling people to prayer but also to work. They warned of fires or attacks. The sound of the bells was the shared soundtrack of everyone's life. The parish priest was a central figure, but the community was run by the Lady of the Ordinary People. They elected church wardens who managed the parish finances. These wardens were responsible for maintaining the church building, buying candles and vestments, and brewing the church ale. Church ales were massive parish-wide parties, essentially fundraisers. The whole village would gather to drink specially brewed beer, with the profits going to the upkeep of the church. It was a sacred duty that looked a lot like a beer festival. Baptism made you a member of the community. Marriage was a public contract witnessed by the community, and death was a communal affair. The parish had a requiem guild or a chantry where members would pay a subscription to ensure that after they died, prayers would be said for their souls. When someone died, the whole village would be involved in the vigil, the funeral mass, and the burial in the churchyard, where their ancestors were also buried. You were surrounded by your community in life, and you were laid to rest among them in death. This wasn't about being more spiritual than we are. It was about the complete fusion of the sacred and the secular. Your community was your congregation. Your neighbors were your brothers and sisters in Christ, not just in a metaphorical sense, but in a practical, day-to-day reality. The Reformation in the 16th century, by challenging the central role of the parish and its rituals, didn't just change theology. As historians like Christopher Hay have argued, it fundamentally altered the social fabric of England. It was the beginning of the separation of religion from public life, a process that has led to our current state of religious privacy and perhaps social fragmentation. We know that the parish was the center of life, but how much of people's participation was driven by genuine faith versus social pressure? Was the parish a source of genuine comfort and unity, or was it an instrument of social control, enforcing conformity through the threat of damnation? How did people reconcile their very human and often violent squabbles with the Christian ideal of loving their neighbor? And can a secular institution, a community center, a school, a club design, ever hope to replicate the deep, all-encompassing sense of belonging that the medieval parish provided? At number 11, what if death was a public event? We treat death as a medical failure. It happens in hospitals, behind closed doors. It is sanitized and professionalized. We talk about it in hushed tones. The grieving process is private. It is something to get through, often with the help of therapists. We have pushed death to the very margins of our experience. In the Middle Ages, death was at the center of life. It was everywhere. Infant mortality was high. A simple infection could kill you. Life was fragile and often short. Because of this, death was not hidden away. It was a public, communal, and highly ritualized process. The historian Philippe Aries, in his work The Hour of Our Death, described the medieval concept of the tame death. When a person knew they were dying, it was not a moment of private terror. It was a public ceremony. The dying person would take to their bed, and the room would fill with family, friends, and neighbors. Even children were present. The priest would come to administer the last rites, a set of rituals known as the ars moriendi, or the art of dying. This was a skill to be learned. The goal was to die a good death, which meant confessing your sins, forgiving your enemies, and accepting your fate with courage and faith. The entire community participated in the process. After death, the body would be washed and shrouded by family members, not by a professional undertaker. A vigil would be kept, with people praying around the body. The funeral procession to the church was a public event, with the whole village participating. The burial in the churchyard was a reminder that the dead were not gone. They were just in a different part of the community, sleeping, waiting for the final resurrection. People believed in a strong connection between the living and the dead. The living prayed for the souls of the dead in purgatory, and they believed the dead, in turn, could intercede for them. This constant, visible presence of death shaped the community's outlook. It fostered a sense of solidarity in the face of shared mortality. It also encouraged a different perspective on life. The memento mori tradition, remember you must die, was not meant to be morbid. It was a call to live a good and meaningful life, because life was short and judgment was certain. This is why medieval art is so full of images of skulls and skeletons. They weren't trying to be scary. They were trying to be honest. Our modern approach, by hiding death, has made it more terrifying. We lack a shared script for how to die and how to mourn. We have outsourced the care of the dying and the dead to professionals. We have lost the communal rituals that once guided people through the most difficult part of life. We have gained longer lives, but we may have forgotten how to face the end of them. We have artistic and religious texts describing the good death, but was it really so serene for the average person? How much of this ritual was a comfort, and how much was a terrifying public performance of piety? In an age without painkillers, how did the physical reality of suffering and pain interact with these calm spiritual ideals? And in our secular medicalized world, is it possible to create new, meaningful public rituals around death, or have we lost that capacity forever? Number 10. What if we all shared one big backyard? Think about the land around you. It is divided, fenced, and owned. There's private property, your house, your yard. There is public property, a city park. And there is commercial property. Every square inch is accounted for. You need permission to be almost anywhere. For centuries in the Middle Ages, this was not the case. A huge amount of land was held in common. This was the commons. It wasn't owned by an individual, nor was it a free-for-all wilderness. It was a shared resource managed by the community upon which everyone's survival depended. The commons included the village green, pastures for grazing animals, and forests. Every villager had certain rights to use these lands. They had the right of pasture, to graze a certain number of cows or sheep. They had the right of pawnage, to let their pigs forage for acorns in the woods. They had the right of estovers, to gather firewood, and the right of turbary to cut turf for fuel. These rights were the foundation of the peasant economy. Without the commons, a family could not survive. This system required a high degree of cooperation and self-regulation. The community had to decide how many animals could be grazed without destroying the pasture. They had to manage the woodlands to ensure they weren't overharvested. These rules were not written down in complex legal codes. They were part of a shared understanding enforced by the manorial court. This is a direct contradiction of the famous 1968 essay by Garrett Hardin, The Tragedy of the Commons, which argued that any shared resource will inevitably be destroyed by individual self-interest. Hardin's theory is a cornerstone of modern economics and the justification for privatization. But Hardin was wrong, or at least, his theory did not apply to the historical reality. For centuries, communities successfully managed their commons. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom spent her career studying this. She showed that when a community has shared norms, a sense of mutual trust, and a way to monitor behavior, it can manage common resources sustainably for a very long time. The medieval village was a perfect example of her findings. The system of the commons began to break down with the enclosure movement, which started in the later Middle Ages and accelerated dramatically in the 18th century. Wealthy landowners, with the help of Parliament, began fencing off the common lands for their own private use, usually to raise sheep for the booming wool trade. This was a catastrophe for the rural poor. They lost their ancient rights, their economic independence, and their connection to the land. They were forced to become wage laborers or to move to the growing cities. This was the birth of the modern privatized landscape. We gained a more efficient agricultural system, but we lost a model of shared stewardship that had worked for 1,000 years. Elinor Ostrom's work showed that common resource management can work, but how much of the medieval commons' success was due to the inescapable nature of the community? Did it work only because people couldn't leave and had to cooperate? Was there a constant low-level conflict over resources that the official records don't capture? And is it truly possible to create a new commons in our transient, individualistic, and globally connected world like a digital commons, or was it a product of a time and place that can never be replicated? Number 9. What if your safety net was your neighbor? If you lose your job today, you might apply for unemployment benefits. If you get sick, you have health insurance or a public health system. If you become disabled, there are government programs. Our safety net is a vast impersonal bureaucracy. It is based on taxes and laws, not relationships. In the Middle Ages, the safety net was the person next door. There was no concept of a welfare state. The primary unit of Social Security was the family. But families were fragile. Parents died young. The community had to step in. This wasn't based on an abstract sense of charity. It was based on a hard-headed system of mutual obligation. This system was called Frank Pledge in England. It was a legal and social arrangement where groups of about 10 households were bound together. They were mutually responsible for each other's conduct. If one person in the group committed a crime, the others were responsible for bringing him to court. If they didn't, the whole group would be fined. This created a powerful incentive for people to police each other. It was a form of hyperlocal, community-based law enforcement, but the bonds went deeper than that. This sense of mutual responsibility extended to all aspects of life. Consider the harvest. It was the most critical time of the year. The entire village's food supply for the next year depended on getting the crops in before the weather turned. This was an all-hands-on-deck event. Everyone worked together in the fields, from the youngest to the oldest. If one family's father was sick, others would help harvest his strips of land in the common fields. They did this not just out of kindness, but because a failed harvest for one family weakened the entire village. This interdependence was woven into the fabric of the economy. A blacksmith depended on the farmer for food. The farmer depended on the blacksmith for tools. The weaver depended on the shepherd for wool. This web of local production and consumption created what the historian Mark Bluck called the bonds of dependence. People were not free, independent agents in a market. They were nodes in a dense network of reciprocal relationships. This system provided a powerful form of security. You were embedded in a community that needed you and that you needed in return. But it also meant you had very little individual freedom. Your obligations were not a choice. They were a condition of your existence. We have chosen a different path. We have created systems that give us more freedom from our neighbors. We can rely on anonymous state agencies and global corporations, but in gaining that freedom, we have lost the security of being deeply, inescapably needed by the people around us. We romanticize the idea of neighbors helping each other, but how much of this mutual aid was actually coerced by social pressure and the lord of the manor? What happened to the people who were disliked, the outcasts, the chronically ill? Did the community truly care for them, or were they left to starve? How did the system of mutual obligation function during a crisis like a famine, when resources were scarce for everyone? And is it possible that our impersonal bureaucratic safety net, for all its flaws, is actually more just and equitable than a system based on personal relationships and social popularity? Number 8, what if your knowledge came from people, not screens? Where do you get your information? From the internet, from books, from television. We live in an age of infinite accessible data. Knowledge is a commodity stored externally and retrieved on demand. Our brains are hard drives. In the Middle Ages, knowledge was not a thing you looked up. It was a thing you held in your head and passed on through your voice. The vast majority of people were illiterate. For a peasant in the 11th century, the idea of reading a book would be as foreign as the idea of flying to the moon. This did not mean they were ignorant. It meant they lived in a profoundly oral culture. Knowledge was transmitted through stories, songs, proverbs, and direct instruction. A farmer taught his son how to plow not by giving him a manual, but by taking him to the field and showing him year after year. A mother taught her daughter how to spin wool by sitting with her and guiding her hands. Skills were passed from body to body, not from page to eye. This was the essence of apprenticeship. It was a deep, personal transfer of embodied knowledge. History was not learned from textbooks. It was learned from the stories told by the old people in the village, like the great epic poems like Beowulf or the Song of Roland were not read silently in a study. They were performed aloud by traveling minstrels in the Lord's Hall or the village square, often from memory. These were the movies and the news and the history lessons of the age, all rolled into one. A good storyteller was a pillar of the community, the keeper of its identity and its memories. Even religious knowledge was primarily oral and visual. The priest would read from the Latin Bible, which no one understood. But then he would give a sermon in the vernacular explaining the stories. The church walls were covered in paintings and stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Bible. These were the books of the illiterate. A peasant could read the story of the creation or the crucifixion just by looking at the walls of their parish church. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 was one of the most revolutionary events in human history. It made knowledge cheap, replicable, and accessible. It fueled the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the scientific revolution. It created our modern world of literacy and data, but it also destroyed the oral culture that had preceded it. We gained the ability to store vast amounts of information outside ourselves. But we may have weakened our own memories and our reliance on each other as sources of wisdom. We no longer need the village elder to tell us the old stories. We have Wikipedia. How accurate was the knowledge transmitted in an oral culture? Without written records to check against, how much did stories and histories change with each telling, becoming more legend than fact? Did the reliance on memory give medieval people a different kind of intelligence, a different way of structuring thought that we have now lost? We assume literacy is an unalloyed good, but what specific cognitive and social skills atrophied when we began to rely on the written word? And in an age of digital misinformation, is there anything we can learn from a culture that valued the authority of the trusted human voice over all else? Number 7. What if conflict was part of the relationship? How do we handle serious conflict today? We avoid. We ghost people. We unfriend them. Or we escalate to the legal system. We see conflict as a failure, a breakdown of a relationship. The goal is to eliminate it or to have a third party resolve it so we don't have to deal with it anymore. In the Middle Ages, conflict was an expected and ongoing part of community life. In a small village where you couldn't leave, avoidance was not an option. You had to deal with the people who wronged you because you were going to see them tomorrow and the day after that for the rest of your life. This created a very different approach to disputes. The concept of the feud is a good example. We think of feuds like the Hatfields and McCoys as irrational, endless cycles of violence. And they could be. But in the early Middle Ages, before the strong centralized states, the feud was a primary mechanism for justice. As described in Germanic law codes like the Salic law, if someone from one family injured or killed someone from another, the victim's family had the right to seek retribution. This wasn't chaotic violence. It was a highly regulated social process. The goal was not to wipe out the other family, but to restore a balance of honor. Often the feud would end not with more bloodshed, but with the payment of war guild or man money. This was a set price list for every possible injury. A lost eye was worth a certain amount. A severed hand was worth another. A life was worth the most of all. The price varied depending on the social status of the victim. A nobleman's life was worth far more than a peasant's. The families, with the help of community leaders, would negotiate a settlement. The payment of Wergild healed the breach, restored honor, and allowed the two families to coexist. It was a form of restorative justice. Even at the village level, conflict was constant and open. The manorial court records are full of people suing each other for slander, for trespass, for debt. These were not relationship-ending events. They were a way of navigating the constant friction of close living. People would be in a bitter dispute one week and then be working side by side in the fields the next. Conflict was not a sign the community was broken. It was a sign the community was alive and working through its problems. Our modern approach seeks a clean break. We want a final verdict, a dissolved partnership, a blocked number. We prioritize individual peace over communal entanglement. The medieval world, out of necessity, prioritized the preservation of the community, even if it meant living in a state of permanent, managed friction. They knew that a relationship without conflict wasn't a strong relationship. It was a non-existent one. We see the rules of Wergild, but did this system truly provide justice, or did it simply allow the rich and powerful to literally get away with murder by paying a fine? How did the emotional reality of grief and anger fit into this cold calculus of compensation? In the village setting, how much did the open airing of grievances actually resolve issues, versus just driving them underground to fester into deeper resentments? And is our modern desire to avoid conflict a sign of a more civilized society, or a sign of our social cowardice and the fragility of our relationships? Number 6. What if we valued idleness? We live in a culture of productivity. We are obsessed with efficiency, with life hacks, with optimizing our time. Hustle culture tells us that every spare moment should be turned into a side project or self-improvement. We feel guilty for being idle. We see rest as a means to an end to recharge, so we can be more productive later. This would have seemed very strange to someone in the Middle Ages. They worked hard, incredibly hard. Agricultural labor was backbreaking, but their lives were not governed by the clock or the relentless pursuit of productivity. Their world was punctuated by large amounts of what we would consider idleness. As mentioned before, the liturgical calendar was filled with holy days, which were mandatory days of rest and celebration. But the idleness went deeper than that. The very rhythm of work was different. It was based on the sun and the seasons, not the 9-to-5 schedule. In the winter, when the days were short and there was less agricultural work to do, people spent a lot more time indoors. It was a period of rest and repair, of mending tools and telling stories. The pace of life slowed down dramatically. This wasn't seen as laziness. It was the natural order of things. The philosopher Josef Pieper, in his book Leisure, The Basis of Culture, argues that the modern world has confused leisure with entertainment or a break from work. For the ancients and for medieval thinkers, leisure was something else entirely. It was a state of contemplative stillness and openness to the world, a time for philosophical and spiritual reflection. It was not for the sake of work. It was the very purpose of life. Work was what you did to earn the right to have leisure. This idea is completely inverted for us. We see leisure as something we earn by working hard. For them, work was the means, and leisure in the sense of celebration, contemplation, and community was the end. The German sociologist Max Weber famously argued in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism that a major shift occurred during the Reformation. Certain Protestant aversions to idleness and Catholic feast days, combined with a focus on work as a divine calling, helped create the cultural conditions for modern capitalism. Hard work and the accumulation of wealth became signs of moral virtue. Idleness became a sin. We are the inheritors of this work ethic. We have internalized the idea that our value as people is tied to our productivity. The medieval peasant who might have spent a Wednesday afternoon at a raucous church ale festival would likely look at our overscheduled, optimized, and anxious lives and wonder what we are working so hard for. How much of this idleness was truly restful, and how much was just a period of anxious waiting during the lean months of winter, hoping the food stores would last? Was the lack of a work ethic a sign of a more humane culture, or did it simply contribute to the economic stagnation and low standard of living for most people? We can analyze the number of holidays, but can we ever know if people felt genuinely fulfilled by them or if they were just bored and restless? And if we were to reclaim the value of true idleness, how could we do so in an economic system that is fundamentally built on the principle of constant growth and productivity? Number 5, what if your family was a corporation? We think of family as a private emotional sanctuary. It is based on love and personal choice. Our nuclear family, two parents and their children is the standard. We might be close to our grandparents or cousins, but the core unit is small and independent. In the Middle Ages, family was a much larger and more public institution. It was less about emotional fulfillment and more about survival, power, and property. For the nobility, marriage was not a romance. It was a strategic alliance. The marriages of sons and daughters were used to seal treaties, acquire land, and cement political power. A noblewoman was a piece of valuable property, her marriage a key move in a dynastic chess game. Even for ordinary people, the family was an economic unit above all else. The household was the center of production. A peasant family worked the land together. A craftsman's family lived and worked in the same building, with the wife and children all contributing to the trade. The household, as described by historians like George S. Dubey, included not just the nuclear family, but also apprentices, servants, and elderly relatives. It was a small corporation, with the head of the household as its CEO. The concept of lineage was incredibly important. Your identity was not just your own. You were a link in a chain stretching back to your ancestors and forward to your descendants. Your primary duty was to preserve and enhance the family's property and reputation. This collective identity meant that the actions of one member reflected on the entire family. The honor of the family name was paramount. An insult to one person was an insult to the whole lineage, which is one reason feuds could be so bitter and long-lasting. This also meant that there was less emphasis on the individual. The idea of a young person finding themselves or choosing a career based on personal passion would have been nonsensical. Your path was largely determined by your birth, your family's needs, and your place in the social order. This sounds terribly restrictive to us, and it was, but it also provided a powerful sense of place and purpose. You were part of something much larger than yourself. Your life had a clear, defined role in a multi-generational project. The shift towards our modern idea of the family based on romantic love and individualism was a slow one, developing over centuries. It has given us immense personal freedom, but it has also placed a huge emotional burden on the nuclear family. We expect our spouse to be our best friend, our romantic partner, our co-parent, and our therapist. We expect the small family unit to provide all the economic and emotional support that was once spread across a much wider network of kin and community. When it fails, we are left isolated. We read marriage contracts and inheritance documents, but what was the true emotional content of a medieval family? Was it really as cold and strategic as the records suggest, or was it filled with the same love, jealousy, and affection as any modern family, just expressed differently? How did individuals cope with the immense pressure of upholding the family honor? What happened when someone's personal desires clashed with the needs of the lineage? And in trading the corporate family for the romantic one, have we gained more happiness or just more anxiety? Number 4, what if your leaders were awful and you knew it? We live in an age of political disillusionment. We complain about our leaders. We feel they are corrupt, incompetent, or out of touch. But we hold on to a democratic ideal. We believe that in theory we can vote them out. We have a mechanism for change, even if it feels ineffective. The medieval peasant had no such illusions. The social and political structure was a rigid hierarchy ordained by God. At the top was the king. Below him were the great lords, then lesser knights, and at the very bottom, the vast majority of the population, the peasants. The organizing principle was feudalism. In theory, it was a system of mutual obligation. The peasant worked the land for the lord. In return, the lord provided protection from bandits and invading armies. In reality, it was often a system of brutal exploitation. The lord of the manor had immense power over his tenants. They could tax them, demand labor from them, and find them in his court. The 14th century English poem, Piers Plowman, is a powerful critique of this system, portraying the suffering of the poor at the hands of corrupt officials and greedy lords. People were not blind to the injustice of their situation. They knew their leaders were often selfish and cruel. They knew the system was rigged against them, but for centuries, there was little they could do about it. The open rebellion was rare and usually crushed with extreme violence. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England is a famous exception. Fueled by resentment over taxes and a new sense of worth after the Black Death, peasants marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom. They were brutally suppressed, but it was a sign that the old deference was cracking. So how did people cope in a system they knew was unjust but could not change? They developed a culture of what the political scientist James C. Scott calls hidden transcripts. In public, they would show deference to the Lord. They would bow and use respectful titles. But in private, in the village alehouse, or around the fire, they would tell stories and jokes that mocked their superiors. They would sing songs about the clever peasant who outwits the greedy priest or the foolish knight. This was a form of psychological resistance. This created a kind of hard-headed realism. They did not expect the world to be fair. They did not expect their leaders to be virtuous. They relied on their own community, their families, and their faith to get by. Their hopes were not invested in political change, but in a good harvest, a healthy family, and salvation in the next life. This is a profound contrast to our own era, where we are constantly agitated by the political news cycle, placing our hopes for happiness and security in the hands of politicians we claim to despise. How pervasive was this hidden transcript of resistance? Was it a genuine source of solidarity, or just a way of letting off steam that ultimately changed nothing? We have a few surviving poems and songs, but what were the everyday unrecorded forms of mockery and dissent? How did the constant, daily performance of submission affect people's sense of self-worth? And is it possible that our modern political outrage, which feels so active and engaged, is actually less effective and more psychologically damaging than the medieval peasant's strategy of public compliance and private ridicule? Number 3, what if beauty was for everyone? Where do we encounter beauty in our daily lives? We might go to an art museum. We might buy a designer object. We might see a beautiful film. For the most part, we think of art as something separate from ordinary life. It is created by professional artists, displayed in special places, and often owned by the wealthy. In the Middle Ages, art and craft were not separate. The most beautiful objects were functional objects. And beauty was not a luxury for the elite. It was a part of the everyday public environment, most notably in the parish church. The great cathedrals of Europe, like Chartres in France or Canterbury in England, are the most obvious examples. These were astonishing feats of engineering and art. They took centuries to build. The money and labor came not just from kings and bishops, but from the collective effort of entire communities. The guilds would sponsor stained glass windows depicting their patron saints. Ordinary people would contribute what little they could. These buildings were a source of immense civic pride. They were the public art galleries of their day, filled with sculpture, painting, and craftsmanship of the highest order. And they were open to everyone, from the richest merchant to the poorest beggar. But this commitment to beauty extended down to the level of the humble village church. Even a small parish church would be the most richly decorated building for miles around. It might have wall paintings, a carved font, and embroidered vestments. These things were created by local craftsmen. They were not great artists in our sense. They were anonymous masons, carpenters, and weavers who saw their work as an offering to God and a gift to their community. The writer John Ruskin in the 19th century was a fierce critic of industrialization. He looked back to the Middle Ages as a time when the worker was not a cog in a machine, but a craftsman who could take pride in his work. He argued that the imperfections in a piece of medieval carving were a sign of the craftsman's humanity and freedom, something that was being destroyed by the perfect, soulless products of the factory. Our modern world is built for efficiency, not beauty. Our public spaces are often bland and utilitarian. Our everyday objects are mass-produced and disposable. We have separated the artist from the craftsman and art from life. We have made beauty a commodity, something to be consumed in our leisure time, rather than an integral part of our shared world. The medieval community, for all its poverty and hardship, believed that beauty was not a luxury. They believed it was a spiritual necessity, and they worked together to create it for everyone to share. We see the beautiful churches that have survived, but what about the vast majority of ordinary, everyday objects that have long since rotted away? Was the average peasant's home and life as devoid of beauty as we imagine, or did they have a folk art and craft tradition that is now lost to us? How much of the communal effort to build cathedrals was voluntary and joyful, and how much was a form of coerced labor and heavy taxation? And in a secular, pluralistic society, is it still possible to rally a community around a shared project of creating public beauty, or was that kind of unity only possible in an age of unified faith? Number 2, what if your world was tiny but deep? Our world is vast. We can see images from Mars on our phones. We can talk to someone on the other side of the planet in an instant. We follow news from dozens of countries. We have access to the accumulated knowledge of all of human history. Our world is a mile wide and an inch deep. The world of a medieval peasant was the opposite. It was perhaps 5 miles wide. For many, their entire life would be spent within a day's walk of their village. They might have heard of London or Rome, but these were almost mythical places. Their mental map was their village, the surrounding fields, the woods, and the next village over. That was the entire universe. This was not a world of choice and variety. The food was monotonous. The entertainment was whatever you could make yourselves. The people you knew were the same people you had always known. From our perspective, it seems incredibly limited, boring, and claustrophobic. But this limited world was known with an incredible intimacy. A peasant didn't just know the land, they knew every fold and dip in a particular field. They knew which trees were best for firewood and which ones were home to certain birds. They knew the subtle signs in the sky that predicted the weather. This was a deep sensory knowledge born of a lifetime of observation. The geographer Yi-Fu Tuan wrote about the difference between space and place. Space is abstract, a location on a map. Place is space that has been filled with meaning and memory. The medieval villager lived entirely in place. Their social world was just as deep. In a community of a few hundred people you've known your entire life, you don't have superficial relationships. You know the complex history between two families that goes back 3 generations. You know who can be trusted, who holds a grudge, who is a gossip. You understand the intricate web of kinship, obligation, and resentment that holds the village together. This is a level of social knowledge that is almost impossible for us to achieve in our mobile, fragmented society. We have gained a breadth of knowledge that would be unimaginable to them. We are global citizens. But we have paid a price. We have become tourists in our own lives, skimming the surface of many places and relationships, but rarely putting down the deep roots that create a true sense of belonging. The medieval peasant had no choice but to belong. Their tiny worlds demanded a depth of attention to the land, to the seasons, to each other that we may have forgotten how to give. Was this deep knowledge of place a source of genuine wisdom and connection, or was it just a set of practical survival skills with no higher meaning? Did the lack of exposure to other cultures and ideas lead to a more stable society, or did it just breed suspicion, prejudice, and a violent fear of outsiders? We can map the physical boundaries of a medieval manor, But can we ever reconstruct the mental and emotional map of a person who lived their entire life within it? And is it possible, in our globalized age, to consciously choose to live in a smaller, deeper world without simply becoming ignorant and parochial? Number one, what if community wasn't a choice? Why are you part of the communities you are in? You chose them. You chose your friends based on shared interests. You might choose to join a book club, a sports team, or a church. If you don't like it, you can leave. We think of community as an optional lifestyle accessory. It is a voluntary association of like-minded individuals. This is the most fundamental piece of forgotten wisdom. In the Middle Ages, community was not a choice. It was a fact. It was a condition of existence. You were born into it. You did not choose your village, your family, your lord, or your parish. You did not choose your obligations. They were given to you. This community was not based on shared interests or personal affection. You were bound to people you might not like. You were tied to your grumpy neighbor, your dishonest cousin, and your overbearing priest. The basis of the community was not liking each other. It was needing each other. It was a community of necessity forged by shared vulnerability in a dangerous world. The sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies distinguished between two types of social groups. He called them Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Gemeinschaft, which is often translated as community, is the medieval model. It is a group based on kinship, tradition, and a shared sense of place. Relationships are personal and multifaceted. You are bound to the whole person, not just to one of their roles. Gesellschaft, or society, is the modern model. It is a group based on rational self-interest, formal contracts, and impersonal roles. We interact with a cashier, a lawyer, a bus driver. Our relationships are transactional and specialized. We have the freedom to associate with whomever we choose. We have overwhelmingly chosen Gesellschaft. We value freedom, individuality, and choice above all else. We want communities we can join and leave as we please. We want relationships that serve our personal needs and that we can discard when they no longer do. We see the medieval model of inescapable, obligatory community as a kind of prison. And in many ways it was, but that prison provided something we desperately lack. It provided a place. It provided a role. It provided a sense of being unconditionally part of something. Whether you were liked or not, whether you were successful or not, you belonged because you were there. It was not something you had to earn or build or find. It simply was. We have gained the freedom to create our own communities, but we have also gained the freedom to be utterly and completely alone. The forgotten wisdom is that true community may not be something you find. It might be something you are bound to, for better or for worse. We rightly celebrate the end of a world where your life was determined by birth. But in dismantling that world, did we discard something essential about human belonging? Is it possible that the deepest and most resilient communities are not the ones we choose, but the ones we are forced to reckon with? What does it mean if the very thing we value most, individual choice, is the primary obstacle to creating the deep community we claim to crave? And could there ever be a way to have the security of the old bonds without the suffocation, the belonging without the bondage? We still don't know.